how I transformed this fabric panel from Hoffman Fabrics into abstract art using half square triangles. I do recommend that you start your fabric prior to cutting. This helps with keeping your final quilt from biasing in the end. We're going to be doing a series of half square triangles, and so the starch really helps to stabilize those blocks. So let's get started cutting. Now that I have these printed edges lined up as best we can, I am going to start by identifying where our panel edge is. And this panel is essentially measuring 32 inches. So I'm going to cut it right in the center and then cut out from there. That way we don't end up with one side with more of this unprinted edge than the other. When we're finished, if there is some of this unprinted edge in our half square triangles, more than likely they will get trimmed off. So there's no concern about that. And it could potentially be buried in the seam allowance when we do the construction. Because our panel is 32 inches wide, we're going to cut in half at 16. And then we're going to cut both halves in half. Don't move your strips. Leave them on your cutting mat in the grid. And now we're going to cut off the salvage edge because now I know that I have plenty. You'll notice that I haven't folded my fabric in fourths because I want my strips to be cut as straight as possible. So now we have our strips all cut. And if you're doing the 2-panel option, you'll cut 2 panels like this. And if you're doing the 1-panel option, you'll just do 1. Now we'll stack our strips on top of each other. Lining up our cut edges. I like to lay my long ruler down on the strip just to keep everything lined up as best we can and keep it from shifting. I'm going to pull this down and use my cutting mat as my guide and make my first subcut. After I make this initial cut, I will trim off the salvage edge. You can see how laying this long ruler on the strip really helps keep it intact and it keeps it from shifting. There is very little waste when you're cutting this panel into the grid. This will be all that will be remaining and you can just add it to your scrap bin. Now that we have our 2 panels cut up for the 2-panel option, it's time to attach our labels so that we can coordinate the 2 squares that need to go together to create our half square triangles. We will use the layout guide on page 3 for the panel 2 option to determine which one of these squares goes with its partner. Now we get to play a game where we match our label to our fabric block, and I like to use these little clips to attach them. So you just kind of go through them and see what most closely matches where we have cut, and match the label that has a corresponding number on it to the fabric square. kind of like one of those games we used to play when we were kids with playing cards. They may not match identically, but you'll get close. Some will be easier to identify than others. And then it just gets down to process of elimination. I do like to sort them by numbers so that I know right where to go when I go to put the two sections together. Just makes it easier. And of course, the cabins are super easy to identify. Now that we have our panel all cut into strips, subcut, and labeled, following the layout guide on page 3, we will create our sets. We will then do 8 at a time half square triangles. So I have set up my machine for this project. I've changed out my needle. I'm using a 50 weight thread. I've shortened my stitch length to 2.0. I've switched out my stitch plate to a straight stitch plate. Some machines have this option. I've cleaned out my bobbin area and checked that and given the machine a little oil. I generally will do this practice when I'm starting a project just so that we're set up for success. I'm placing the right-hand side of my 1/4 inch presser foot next to the drawn line, and we'll start in the upper diagonal corner and sew down to the bottom. And I just spin it and bring it back around for the other side. One tip is to watch your presser foot and not your needle. You may have noticed how I have my pins placed, and that is so that when I'm coming down, this is holding this section in place so that it doesn't bias or shift on me. And I'll remove my pins. By starting out with the proper steps in place, you will get a great finished result. You can see how flat that is laying. So that went very quickly. We just have 10 of these blocks, super simple and easy to finish. Before I cut though, I'm going to go ahead and give these a little press just so that everything is lying flat before we go to cut these half square triangles apart. Now we're ready to cut up our half square triangles. I'll be using a cutting ruler and a rotary cutter. I have a pair of scissors, a triangle in the day ruler, triangle square ruler, and a secondary cutting mat. This protects your mat from repeated cutting in one area. That I got at a Dollar Tree. I have lined up my block in the grid so that the corners are matching, and I'll be using my ruler with a 45-degree mark on the drawn line on our square. So lining that up, we're also lining up the grid on the ruler with the grid on the mat, along with our square that we're going to cut, and in the center as well. We're going to cut this in half. Now that we have the two pieces cut in half, we'll turn it around so that it's lined up again on the grid. The center mark is in the center as well. And then I'm flipping the other section around, and the point in the center is on the same mark as the point at the top. And we will cut these two sections in half again, and we will then have 4 pieces. Making sure everything is lined up just how you want it. And the more precise you are now, the less cutting you will have to do when you're squaring up your triangles. We'll now stack our triangles and putting the point on one of the marks on the mat at the top and the bottom, and then subsequently lining up the additional squares in the same manner, stacking one on top of another. Just like that. Now we'll line up our cutting ruler on the marked line, and you'll see that the 1/4 inch mark is on the stitch line, and we'll slice through all 4 subsections. And now we have 8 half square triangles. I now use the scissors to create 45-degree cuts to cut off the dog ear of the triangles. I find this is much quicker than trying to do it with my rotary cutter. I can do it very quickly, and it just minimizes that effort. You'll notice that we have one edge that's cut very nice and straight, and then we have our outer edge of our block that has a little bit extending from it. Using our triangle square up ruler, I have 3.5 inch lined up on the stitch line, just off just slightly, and we will only need to do 1 cut, and now we have a perfectly cut 3.5 inch square triangle. You can see there's a little overlap on that one side, so you do want to check to make sure that you're squaring up on the correct side of the triangle, and that way you only have to make 1 cut and you're done. Now we have our stack of 8 half square triangles for this fabric set, and I'm attaching the label here for later use. Now that they're all done, everything's squared up nicely, we're ready to press these open. I like to use a clapper. I have a square clapper here. I use this quite a bit, and it helps keep my seams nice and flat. I recommend that, or if all you have is a heavy book, use a book. Removing my fabric label, I'm opening up my half square triangle here. And you want to be gentle. This is a bias. And when you go to put your iron down, I hover over the seam line prior to giving it its final press. And if you have a little dog ear sticking out, we can always trim that off later and then put it under the clapper. So again, using the point of your iron, just kind of hover over that seam to get it nice and flat, and then press down. Don't stretch your seams. Now that we have all of our half square triangles pressed, we'll stack them neatly together and attach our fabric label. If you're interested in seeing what I do with these half square triangles with this fabric panel, stay tuned for part 2, where I show you how I lay all this out into a grid to create abstract art. Like and subscribe, and until I see you again, happy stitching.